What's up, everybody? Welcome to Puzzle Huddle with Experts. I have another fantastic guest, Dr. Keisha Scarlett. She's a doctor of education, education professional, and we're very excited to have her to learn about her background, her expertise, and some of the initiatives and programs she's really proud of. So thank you so much, Dr. Scarlett, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Just to set the foundation for where we can drive our conversation, can you share with us what you're professionally an expert in?
I would say if I had an area of expertise, it would be in leveraging my role as a central office educational administrator to build movements. And so that is like my area of focus. So my role in Seattle Public Schools is the chief academic officer, or now assistant superintendent of academics. But what is consistent for me across my 10 maybe roles that I've had in SPS, now moving into my 24th year, is the way that I approach them. I'm a place-based, community-based leader. And so very soon after I've sort of scoped out what's happening in the role, my sort of institutional script that I enact is usually around movement building, that I try to drive equitable outcomes for students unapologetically. For students, I am always leading for Black excellence, to normalize Black excellence and brilliance and protect the genius of Black children in our system, and center that, not because there's not a concern for other children, but I know that when we win, everyone wins. And so I lead in that way. So how do we build movements and help support a cross-sector network of people to conspire to care for our children, particularly those furthest from educational justice, and look at that. How do we move from moments, have that build into momentum, into movements for educational justice for our children?
When you say chief academic officer, is that like pre-K all the way to 12, or what is there?
Yeah.
So there's
absolutely pre-K through 12, plus some post-secondary links into like our local colleges, as well. So I oversee all the P through 12 academics, college and career readiness, our Office of Research, Evaluation, and accountability. I oversee our early learning, as well. So there's a lot of different facets. Also, Department of Liberatory Education, where we provide coursework opportunities and support in ethnic studies, Black studies, Native education, LGBTQ studies, and other supports. And that's a newly established department that we've established under my tenure here. Yeah.
All right, and you said build movements. Now that concept, provocatively, I kind of think of social movements, think of justice movements, I think of political movements, but I don't necessarily think of education as a place for, where a movement can be generated. What's an example of a movement in this education space?
Yeah, so let me give a little context about that. This is what I believe, particularly that high quality systems are arranged around high quality social justice, equity minded school leaders, that they become central to any of the efforts that we enact around improving student achievement, improving the academic and personal well-being for students as well. Equity minded school leaders are create high level goals for what they believe that students have, that they have high aspirations, and those aspirations and goals are informed by students and by families as well in the broader community. So when I say movement building, I always come from the frame of being an educator and then a principal and then moving in the central office as well. That as a movement builder, that means that you're a community organizer, that your job is to create openings and portals for students and families, particularly those furthest from educational justice, to have access to decision making and to be able to, I would say, not only rebalance power, but to transform what power looks like inside of systems. It is a constant quest for me. It is not anything necessarily that I'm an expert at, because I don't know how you really become expert. That's why it's always a slippery slope when someone asks a question about what you're an expert in, but it is my passion, and it how I feel both accountable, but also answerable to community. So when I say I'm place-based and place-bound, I've lived within a 2-mile radius of this area for the last 48 years of my life. And so I go to the same Safeway grocery store, to the same places and spaces as people that I grew up with, that are my family members, that are community people that I've grown up with, my classmates. And so I'm accountable, but also I'm answerable, meaning that when someone asks me why a decision was made or why I made a decision, I need to be answerable to them as the people whose values and interests and priorities must be most considered when we think about the educational lives of our children.
Yeah, when I think about this generation and the generation that is currently enrolled in your school system, and it's the same age as my kids, I'm really overwhelmed with excitement about, their learning opportunities, the curriculum, the breakthroughs in terms of the tools they can use, the insight into history, kind of some of the social dynamics that are going to help, empower and, motivate and inspire them to, move the line for our whole country and for our culture. What are some exciting things that you've recognized in your students in this time frame for education that are really things to be excited about and worth celebrating?
I am so excited about our youth. Youth voice and their values and vision matters, and it needs to be central to what we do and engage in schools. Seattle is a place that is an interesting area, even though our communities of color may be small in terms of the broader white population here. I will not allow Seattle to be white space. It ignores and devalues the contributions of all of the Black and Indigenous and Brown people who have worked and labored to help create this place. So I refuse to allow that. I reject any notion of this being white space. Even if I'm the only Black face that shows up in the space, I will declare Black space in that space because I showed up in that space and I'm here. So you asked a question before about movement building. So I'm gonna, an example, so I'm gonna connect that in with each other. One of the things that resonates with me is that our young people have been fighting in this country for decades. It's well documented in the 50s and 60s for culturally responsive, curriculum, to have Black history, Latinx history taught for them, to have courses that really help to support their identity development. We know that a strong racial identity is actually a salient protective factor for children, for people, for us as people of color in this country. And for Black folks, I'll say in my own example of being a Black person, my parents and community fostered a strong racial and also an academic co-identity for me that really helped to cultivate my genius as a Black girl. And so I feel like that's our work in the system. Well, our young people have been organizing for years to have these things happen and have had empty promises moved out to them. So I've watched the superintendent over time and time, how students have organized to ask for like ethnic studies and Black studies courses. So I'll give an example of that. So there was organizing that happened. Finally, maybe in 2018, someone was hired for the work. But the work doesn't become integral to strategic plan goals. It's not resourced, it's not supported, it's not promoted. There aren't people maybe like me who are in central office leadership roles that are passionate to be the executive sponsors for these types of work. So I saw this play out across even myself, not even being in this role yet. I was previously the chief of equity partnerships and engagement. And before that, I led organizational development as an executive director in our system. When I became the chief of equity partnerships and engagement, I remember being on a call and there were some students, they were high school seniors, and they spoke about how They, were really sad. What they were most sad about was during their sort of lifetime, I guess, of matriculation in Seattle Public Schools, that they never have an opportunity to have ethnic studies. But in spite of that, they were still organizing for the underclassmen and the other students in the system that they knew needed to have access to ethnic studies and Black studies courses. From my seat, I could not be comfortable not pushing into an area that was not necessarily my area, because I didn't lead academics. So I started to think about how I could help support those efforts, and came into an alliance with the former chief academic officer, who I ended up replacing after she left, to really put some strength behind that. And I asked our director over our Department of Racial Equity Advancement to help support and bring and move this work forward. So we fast forward, some things have happened as a result of the youth organizing and us working with youth on the curriculum and working with community on curriculum. We have established ethnic studies. We have educators who are teaching that effort. We have created a new a Black education program. So we have a program manager for ethnic studies, a Black education program manager. We have Black studies that is started. I was just looking at our enrollment data this year, and looking at the schools who have signed up and the students enrollment in that. We have 2,520 students that are enrolled in our school district, and I don't know how many high school students, so I need to kind of get that relative, but Seattle Schools has 50,000 students or so in it. So thinking about how many students are in high school and then how many are enrolled in these courses, it's something that, we're paying attention to and tracking within this. We just developed a community-led effort of grassroots community-led effort to create a Filipino X American history course that has been adopted by some schools, and we're piloting, well, not piloting, but this year is our first launch of that course work as well. The intersectional LGBTQ studies course, looking at enrollment, looking like a really high level course of students. I think 250 students had enrolled in that, and we just launched that also this year. So there's that's what it means to be part of a movement, to enlist your privilege and where you have access to not just bring people to the table, but to take to the table out into community in order to build things and co-construct them together. That's what that transformation of power is. That's what it means to lead with student voice. And as we're even thinking about our program evaluation around some of these efforts, having youth as part of, we call it youth participatory action, of both the design, but also the evaluation and the dissemination or sharing about the experiences that are happening in these courses and what's changing as a result in student climate and their identity formation, both racially and academically, becomes very important. And these courses aren't really just for kids of color. It's really the white children that need these courses the very most.
It's so cool that students now have voice, to have input into the curriculum design. I don't remember any level of school that I ever went through where I was asked what I thought about the curriculum and the direction and the classes. That was not an open question. It was, these are the classes that you get your check mark and take these classes, and then you get on up out of here. But that's awesome that they're allowed to have that input and see offerings or change or solutions based on their feedback.
Absolutely.
Tell me this. I don't want to talk to an administrator without bringing up this headline. And sometimes headlines are misleading. So maybe you help me unpackage what is beneath that. But so the suggestion of a national teacher shortage, how true or untrue is that in your space? And then what might be some of the things that are leading to that in the cases that it is true?
Yeah. Well, I think the education is no different than what's being called this great resignation. I haven't looked at counter information or data around this teacher shortage. And so I would say I have sort of a thought in my mind, a mental model around a teacher shortage nationally and how that might be impacting us, because I haven't spent much time thinking about sort of the counter of that. What I will say is that there's never been a harder time to be an educator, a superintendent, a principal, an educator, or even a parent navigating education right now.
Yeah.
The value proposition for public education has been really tested and challenged pre-pandemic, and very much so now. And it's sort of the conversation about learning loss that's been shared a whole lot, and definitely placed squarely on the shoulders of children of color and families of color, even though everyone has experienced, what's described as learning loss. Well,
Oh, yeah.
there's a, oh,
There's
what's
a
that?
lot, there's a lot of that in the news too.
Yeah,
Suggestion of
yeah,
learning loss over during the
yeah.
pandemic learning
And
years.
so in connection to the educator shortage, one of the things that we think about that, even in the narration of like learning loss, is educators are feeling more and more sort of the pressures of the being over identified as the source of inequity, for students, when there's a lot of levers before you ever get to school leaders and buildings in central office that are contributing to these outcomes. But the public sort of sentiment around public education, it sort of creates a low value proposition in some cases for some educators to persevere. Or how do you find a life balance when we've all been tested by this pandemic to keep schools functioning even when doors were shuttered. And so there's, I think, been a lot of challenges within the profession, but there are some really strong and salient ways that I can say locally that we've been pushing up against, this sort of, I would say, level setting of sorts of like the next sort of phase in the educator profession.
Yeah. So, and I want to get back just a little bit into this concept of equity in education. You talked about some of the classes and the solutions, and that helps with cultural identity and history and self-esteem. But some of the other academic topics, your reading and your math, what might be some of the trends that you're helping to buffer against or provide better outcomes? What are some of the equity trends in math and reading that we should be mindful of, and that educators are attempting to solve or help change course in terms of student outcomes?
Yeah, I think it's like to the point of like what's being narrated around learning loss, particularly for like students of color, Black children and brown children in the country. One of the things that I often think about is pre-pandemic, we were still having unacceptable opportunity gaps and unacceptable levels of students being able to demonstrate proficiency across some different core skills. And so that was unacceptable. And the pandemic has shined a light maybe on the inequities and the inequality that existed prior to pandemic that becomes intergenerational for students and families and students who have been historically marginalized in our systems. In the sort of proposition of us thinking about skills and skills attainment is very important around literacy and mathematics skills. Our students having strong academic identities and having the skills to be able to support that. What I can say is that the pandemic shined a light, I would say in our case, around what we call the foundational, we call it tier 1 or foundational instructional opportunities that students have. What does it look like to have high quality aligned instruction that is combined with equitable and culturally responsive instructional practice of educators who really know how to access the curricular materials and know how to really right scale the type of instruction with high expectations to help both fill in whatever learning areas or gaps that students may have, but also holding them to really high standards. And then how do we really utilize assessment and data in culturally responsive ways to give a full body picture, a full whole child picture of what our students' strengths are and what are the opportunities for growth, within that. And how does that work together within the profession of, like we say, continuous improvement that teachers are working together, educators are working together as teams of a community of practice in order to help look at data and to be able to improve the outcomes for their, for students by using the data that's collected and communicating with their families about those outcomes as well. So the pandemic shined a light on the fact that we didn't have aligned core curriculum. We knew that we didn't have it before, but it was laid bare by the pandemic that not having an aligned K-5 mathematics curriculum where all the educators were doing something different. So there was really it diffused any sort of sense of what we could do in central office. So I don't know if you know about the ESSER 3 funds. There were some funds that were given out to school districts to help them mitigate the impact of pandemic. And so they call them the ESSER funds. And so with our ESSER funds, it's kind of interesting when I talk to other colleagues. We're part of this Council of Great City Schools. These are districts that have 50,000 or greater student populations. When I told them that I had advocated and was pushed to push through a $7 million mathematics K-5 adoption for our students within the pandemic. People couldn't believe that, but it was one of the things that I noticed even before, like I moved into this role within the pandemic, and I was like, we don't have aligned mathematics curriculum, for our students. How can we even hope to ever get on the same page and actually assess what the skills areas are, but being able to have the work, to be able to move it forward. Right when pandemic set, we had just launched a new K-5 reading curriculum, and we could see the traction that we were getting of having this online curriculum, having the culturally responsive text, having the practices that we were really paying attention to within that area. So us being able to launch into that this year, I think has been promising. And also we had just done an adoption for an aligned P12 or K through 12 science material. And again, we could see immediately how educators were able to responsibly pivot to online learning because they had an aligned curriculum to be able to support that. So making sure that we have just the foundational structures and equitable access of high quality textual materials and curriculum materials becomes just foundational to how we can even talk about all of the other areas of sort of supporting students' education, because there was just such inequitable access to the proper level of instructional materials for students.
Yeah, also looking at popular headlines, some of the mental health outcomes related to the pandemic did not spare the student age population. Have you noticed any trends in terms of the mental health status of our students and whether they're optimistic, whether they're depressed, whether are there some things that you're managing or watching for in your school system to help make sure the students have the mental availability to really execute academically?
Yeah, I would say this is for everyone, myself in my role. All of us are impacted by the pandemic. And so, the adults, the students, their families, one of the first things that happened with the pandemic, Seattle was one of the, I'm glad we're being interviewed. Seattle was the first major school district to have to close their doors because Seattle was named an epicenter for the pandemic in March 2020. And so we were the first major school district to close our doors. And so, at first we thought this was going to pass by in a couple of weeks, but then when it kept going, it was like, oh, wow, we have to get ready and really pivot, for this, because we were just preparing to reopen the doors, but we had to prepare for online learning and get technology out to families. And so we became, we've always depended on families and needed to depend on families, even though I think that school systems hold them at an arm's length, but the dependency is real. We needed families just for the outlets to plug in those devices so they could be charged in order to engage in that.
Yeah.
Families were able to see in the classrooms and see instructions and see relationships between students and adults that they'd never been able to see before. There are things from this pandemic, both with the impact of death, that have forever changed us, I will say epigenetically. Our children have a whole new lexicon at really early ages about unmuting and muting. It is just the most bizarre thing ever. We're never going to be able to unsee the impact of these things. So the impact on our social emotional well-being and our mental health and our physical well-being, when the first manifestations for me was I sat in a chair working 16 hours a day, my hip flexors, my hips hurt so badly. I have a cycle right outside of my window right
Yeah,
here, and I
just the line.
upgrade to a Peloton. I had to start exercising because I was just sitting there and all these things were happening. But imagine I have all of these resources that I could like go buy myself a cycle and have all of these things. So the physical, but the mental health challenges that we're noticing that are still there is, it manifested as disengagement. In some sense, some children who have been disengaged before had an option to just turn off their camera and disengage in ways that they weren't able to do. And so we didn't have any suspensions during that time, the whole schools didn't have any suspensions. We seem to be able to figure that out. Those students who have been, really marginalized in spaces and not being able to have a voice, but just the impact of different zip codes. We can track the zip codes who have had the most deaths and the most impacts and infection rates, and the degrees of separation between that and our children is no separation. So the mental health manifestations of our children who were in more unstructured learning environments, not in the same structures, and then really struggling when we did do the return to in-person learning. The lasting effect of depression, students report a higher level of depression. There were attendance impacts, which are early warning indicators, as well. And then at the same thing, when we talk about the Great Resignation, the impacts for adults of trying to balance, particularly female caretakers. The female workforce took a big step back during that. That was like rivaled with, they said, the late 70s of what happened during that time of female caretakers. Many of them who were teachers who were like trying to teach their own children and also teach their classroom at the same time. So the compounding effects of all of these things do impact mental health. But the question is, what do we do and how do we move forward? I don't know if we found all the solutions for that, but we have been really trying to think about how do we use time to help support and reinforce a relationship building, having more resources for mental health support, working with our community-based providers. I did an outreach effort to some of our providers of color so that we can have more diverse providers who really understand the lives and struggles of other students of color that we have and families of color as well, but also being able to, ensure that we have for our most impacted students a set of wraparound supports that include their families as well, to be able to support their thriving in school. And so it's not outside of our thought and understanding about the impact of the mental health impact and how that impacts students' ability to really participate and thrive in our school environments as well. So we haven't figured out all of the solutions to that. There's an acknowledgement of it, resources. We have like an employee wellness manager that's been hired to really help support these things, and just more social workers have been more FTE have been prioritized in our system as well. And I would say large philanthropy has been able to really help support like the Casey Foundation, locally, more mental health support. So there's a broad interest in ensuring that our students have the social emotional wellness in order to really participate and thrive academically.
What about your unique needs population, disability, special education? Are those populations growing in your school system, or are they largely consistent with previous years in terms of different kids having, a range of diagnoses that might be considered special ed, special needs?
Yeah, special education, when you think about our students who are receiving a variety of student supports, I won't say that they're growing. What I will say is within our numbers, there's disproportionality. So there's an over-identification of African-American, particularly African-American males, and other students of color in our highest levels of support, and I would say subjective diagnoses, like what are considered emotional and behaviorally disabled. And so there's a lot of implicit bias and explicit bias, I think, that goes into sometimes diagnoses around students' sort of behaviors and what, those behaviors mean, what are they communicating through those behaviors, and whether or not it is considered a disability. I think it comes largely from, this is what I do know, having a teacher of color just exponentially increases the likelihood of a student being identified as gifted. In the system, we do know that is the strong correlation. Having an educator of color impacts student achievement and it helps them to grow at higher levels. We've seen evidence of that. We have a program that I helped launch in 2019 that I had actually written a proposal for in 2012 when I was a principal, called the Academy for Rising Educators. And this program, after our third cohort, we had 250 educators of color in a pipeline to become future educators in Seattle Public Schools. I believe we had 55 African-American males, 75 of those were African-American females. Across 3 cohorts, we've attracted more people into this program. My own daughter is in cohort 1, and my second daughter, so my eldest is cohort 1, my younger daughter is in the cohort 2. So my eldest daughter's in her 4th year now of a teacher preparation program. My younger daughter is in her 3rd year. My niece is in the program, so she's in her 2nd year. So we're diversifying Seattle Public Schools one Black woman at a time. And my mother actually retired from Seattle Public Schools as a former teacher and former school counselor. So this is definitely family business. And there's a high desire. We have recent high school graduates, current career professionals who might be peer professionals or instructional assistants, but also community members who are able to have tuition-free access, barrier-free access to being able to join this program and complete their bachelor's degree, get their teaching certification, but also get their master's degree as well, both in general education, but also in special education certification in bilingual or English learner, multilingual certification as well. And so, that's what we're doing to help mitigate the shortage of the teacher diversity issue, but also the educator shortage issue, because we know about the multiplicative impact on children, not just children of color, but even white children need to have, Black administrators and brown administrators and educators throughout the time, so that it challenges their worldview around what whiteness means as a normative state by which we've organized, everything around whiteness. So that needs to be challenged, definitely, for all children.
A little bit about why you became a teacher in the first place. Now, you mentioned that your mom was an educator, so that may be the primary driver in terms of just your personality and career choice. But what are some of the things that inspired you to become a teacher in the first place?
Oh, I would say my mother, going into her school. She worked right down, I live in Rainier Beach, and she worked at Rainier Beach High School when I was a child. And we always had extra siblings who would come and live. These were her students. My mother was a special education student. Most of these were males, and they would come and live in our house. My parents are pastors also. So that's a whole other dimension to what service means. I was highly discouraged from becoming a teacher. I knew very early to say that I wanted to be a doctor, and sort of had my parents sort of conspired to build a community around me to help build, I think, a strong, when I say those co-identities, that racial identity, but also my academic identities within math and science. And so whatever resources they had, they really poured it into that. And I was on a trajectory. I attended an HBCU, Clark Atlanta University, and I majored in I majored in chemistry and minored in mathematics. I took the MCAT and was ready to go to medical school, and then I did an internship at Brady Hospital, and I did not like it. I had some experiences there. And one of the things that stood out to me was about the privileges that I had of being in college, having a full ride scholarship, everything that my parents poured into me. And when I saw the condition of people who looked exactly like me, except they had different, Grady Hospital was right in the middle of Grady Homes, where it's built around in that area. That's where I had interned. And back then, that was in the 90s. And seeing poverty at that scale it made me think about the educational opportunities. And then I was also volunteering at Oglethorpe Elementary over there by my campus. And I just have always had a gift with children and love them so much. So even though I left college and decided not to go to medical school and ended up getting a job with Boeing, I had some aspirations that I wanted to go and be a science teacher and a mathematics teacher and give some of the opportunities to students, these salient opportunities I had to cultivate my own genius, as a Black girl. They were protective factors and they propelled me into an early career in STEM and really ignited a lifelong passion for educational equity. And so I use this passion to develop my intellectual acumen and strategize with teams and schools and school leaders and communities and research partners to really enact an ambitious vision for teaching and learning and mathematics and science and other content areas, for our students, because I believe the brilliance of our children is unstoppable. Yeah.
You said something. I'm going to have you back to ask you about growing up as a PK.
Yeah.
With two pastors as parents. I'm sure there was some nuance around that experience that I'm sure is very interesting. But Dr. Scarlett, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for this insight and for your career choice. Hopefully you found it very rewarding. We're glad you're in place in Seattle and helping to develop the curriculum and the programs and the solutions to help our students and creating movements to help our students have great outcomes. So thank you so much for your time. To our audience, if you could like this video and subscribe to the channel, we would really appreciate it. Dr. Scarlett, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.